again in the future if things do not change. Thank you, Chair.
MacAskill.
Thank you, Chair. And as with everyone, I congratulate the member for bringing this important issue that's very appropriate at this time. I'd like to start by saying what this debate is not about. First of all, it's not about benefit fraud, in case the Daily Mail or others thought it was. That is rare, far less than tax avoidance, but it's dealt with by criminal prosecution, rightly so, because it's public funds. Equally, I don't believe that anybody's suggesting that there should be no sanctions. What you require, though, is an appropriate form of sanctions in every walk of life, whether it's in a social club or a political party. If you transgress, then there has to be some implication. If you breach the rules here, then you can face rightly sanctions. And indeed, as a former chair of the judicial panel of the Scottish Football Association, even in sporting terms, if you break the laws with misconduct on or off the park, then you will rightly face some challenge. The issue is the extent of it, that is far too great, certainly at a time of huge austerity. More importantly, it's also about the reasonableness and proportionality of it, because you certainly do not get banned sign-dyed for 2 minor yellow cards in a football match, and yet we have people facing almost something that would bring them to the very end of their life. And equally, it's also the circumstances that we've heard from people in which these sanctions are being imposed, because there has to be some understanding of the individual we're dealing with, the circumstances in which they are living, as opposed to draconian measures. Now, it's well over 40 years since I graduated in law. As part of my law degree, we did welfare law. At that stage, it was national insurance and supplementary benefit. Even then, it has to be said that supplementary benefit, when it was brought in the beverage plan, was set at a level that was viewed as basically the very minimum upon which you could live. But our circumstances have changed since then. Not simply have we gone through mass unemployment, we've moved towards a gig economy, we've moved towards people in vulnerable occupations, we've moved away from the National Insurance Supplementary Benefit Scheme to universal credit. That has caused challenges and it has caused difficulties. But indeed, it seems to me that the moral compass has been lost and we've lost any element of compassion. Because looking back then, the number of people sanctioned, and sanctions did apply in terms of national insurance and supplementary benefit, but it was proportional, reasonable, and certainly not at the extent that we have today. And I think there's 3 issues that follow from that, because as has been mentioned both by the mover of the debate and indeed by others, we do know that punishment is being extracted upon those who work in the Department of Work and Pensions, that they are threatened with punishment and indeed potentially with dismissal if they do not get their number of sanctions up. That is simply unacceptable. This is not about a target-driven system. This is about a welfare state and a welfare system. So it should be the individual and the circumstances, not any spurious targets. And we know from PCS and indeed from other whistleblowers that many people worry that if they do not enforce this sanction against an individual, then they themselves will face those consequences, and that's simply unacceptable. It's not simply from the PCS, we know it from welfare rights officers. Speak to any welfare rights officer in any constituency and they will tell you similar tales. And it even goes beyond that. We now even know and can see it in fictional terms, in terms of what we see in the television and indeed cinema screen, because it's a few years now since the film I, Daniel Blake came out, an award-winning movie that highlighted the difficulties and indeed tragedy of the sanctions scheme. It's a few years past now, but the circumstances remain. I'm fortunate to have been a friend of the film writer for over 40 years. And I know that although the movie was fictional, it was based upon fact. Because as we would meet and discuss, he would tell me about the meetings he had had with people at food banks, the meetings he had had with trade union representatives, the meetings he had had with welfare representatives. And he told me stories such as the woman who had a miscarriage, who was unable to get to her appointment with the DWP and who was sanctioned. Of the young father who rushed to the hospital to be at the birth of his child, whose sister phoned the DWP to say, he cannot come, he's gone to see the birth of his child. That'll be okay. No, it wasn't, because when he next turned up, he found himself sanctioned. Those aren't fiction, they are fact, and it's simply unacceptable. That's why it wasn't Paul Laverty, but Ken Loach, who filmed the movie, who described our benefit system as institutionalised cruelty. And it is, in terms of the sanctions system. It is institutionalised cruelty, because we are taking the most vulnerable people, those who have the least income, at a time of inclement weather, at a time of rising costs and indeed enforced austerity when work can be hard to find as unemployment figures are going up, and treating them harshly. It's not even as if it works, because as other members have mentioned, many of these people, if not most of them, have significant challenges, whether with mental health, whether with educational difficulties, whether, as shown in I. Daniel Blake, simply with being able to access IT. It can, in some instances, be the inability to access the equipment. In other instances, it can be a generational gap, because I'm challenged by IT systems, and those who don't have access to it or my age will be even more challenged. This does not help. What they require is more of a mentoring scheme. So, as I say, in summary, I think what we have to do and what the Minister must try and move towards is by all means retain a sanctions system for those who fundamentally breach it, because that is unacceptable to those who pay their taxes and those who abide by the law and accept it. But where it's something that's an individual who is challenged, then they have to be supported. Where it's an individual who has reasonable, proportionate circumstances and explanation, then they most certainly should not be punished. And we most certainly should not have a system where people are being treated harshly because it's a tick-box system to get the figures up. That is fundamentally wrong. It shouldn't apply even in most private businesses, and it certainly shouldn't apply in a welfare state.
Claudia Webb.